Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Blacktree webinar. I'm Nick Seabrook, Managing Principal here at Blacktree, along with Todd Montigney, Managing Principal here at Blacktree. Todd and I have actually worked together for the better part of 19 years now. I know, hard to believe we look so young, but yeah, this is actually the first webinar that we've done together. So it's good that Todd has a good hair day today, so he looks great on camera. He's just gonna kind of be there, the pretty guy on the side for the first few slides here. And we have a record number of registrants for today, so we're gonna give a couple seconds here to let everybody get in and get settled and learn all about the new RAP rules that are coming about here on January 1st. So without further ado, the agenda. So we wanted this to be a little bit more than just covering the basics. So we are going to cover the basics in terms of what the new RAP rules are going to be starting in January, but then we wanted to dive in. We've been getting a lot of questions. We've had a lot of questions ourselves as we're going through and trying to untangle what this means in terms of its impact on operations, its impact on your EMR, its impact on cash flow. And there's a lot of logistics that we've also come up with in certain RAP scenarios that we really wanted to make sure we uncovered before we had this webinar. So that's why it's so late in the year here, as we only have a couple of weeks left before this actually goes into place. So in addition to those basics, we are going to cover some FAQs. Some of these we developed ourselves. Some of these we've heard on various webinars from a lot of the intermediaries. We're going to dive into the operations impact and really what you should be thinking about today, and making sure that you have all of your T's crossed, I's dotted as we come closer and closer to 1/1. Looking at the EMR impact as well, and we're going to just go through a quick checklist there in terms of, here are some considerations that you want to make sure that you know in terms of how it's going to work in your EMR before the year starts. And one of the other big pieces is the cash flow impact. Now we're obviously going from a 20% reimbursement of the HIPS code value down to 0. So there's going to be a cash flow impact. And we wanted to make sure we walk through some logistics in terms of how you can calculate what that cash flow impact is going to be for your agency. So before we start here, we want to go through some logistics. As always, we have some time that we're going to be setting aside for some Q&A. Feel free to ask those questions in the chat section or the Q&A section. I'll be monitoring that throughout, and we'll be making sure to, hopefully we'll answer a lot of those questions as we go through the presentation. But if there are some questions at the end, we'll definitely save some time there. The handouts for the actual presentation itself are available. If you look in your screen, there's a handout section which will have access to that. And the other piece as well is the polls. So if you've been on a Blacktree webinar before, we do polls throughout. So there'll be 3 polls that we do. Please participate in those polls. Tomorrow we'll be sending out a recap to anyone who registered for today's webinar, and included in that recap is the results of the polls. So it's usually some pretty interesting results based on the polls that we have. So another logistics piece, I know people sometimes have issues with sound. I'm seeing some conversations in the chat already with the sound. If you just click on the actual screen itself, you can actually get sound as that process works. And I'm just realizing as I say this, if you don't have sound, you can't hear me say that. So please type that in.
I was just going to tell you that, Nick.
Thanks, Todd. Without further ado, we'll start with our first poll question here, as before we actually get into the details of the basics. So poll question number 1. Paul, if you want to start that one, how prepared do you feel for the new RAP rules? So I'll start the poll now. That should pop up. Again, please answer those questions. Did that pop up? There we go. Now we're getting some answers. Perfect. Excellent. So again, let's go back to the actual presentation itself. We'll start with the basics. What are those new RAP rules? So in terms of the basics of the rule, RAPs are still going to be submitted for each payment period you have. So we know we switch from PPS to PDGM. We switch from the 60-day episode to the 30-day payment period. RAPs are still going to be required to be submitted for each and every single one of those payment periods. The reimbursement itself, I mentioned before, is being reduced from 20% of that HIPS code value all the way down to 0. And we have a whole new set of pre-bill requirements. So you can see there, they're limited to these 3 components. The initial order, which you're going to get at intake when that person is first referred for home care. The first visit being completed, so that start of care visit actually being completed, or that research visit, and having a valid primary diagnosis codes. Those are the only 3 pieces or components that you need in order to get a RAP out the door starting on 1/1. And then the biggest piece here is the new timely filing restrictions. So in this new model, you now have 5 days to get that RAP submitted from the time that the period starts to the actual submission date. You have 5 days. There are some exceptions. You can see the exceptions listed there. Basically, your natural disasters, fires, floods, earthquakes, or other unusual events. An event that produces a data filing problem at CMS or MAC. A newly certified agency notified of the certification after the Medicare certification date. So those retroactive certifications for new agencies, or the quote unquote other circumstances determined by MAC or the CMS. So those are the only exceptions, but for the most part, you need to get those RAPs on file within 5 days. So how does that payment penalty work? So let's say I didn't submit my RAP within those 5 days. Well, this is exactly how it works. First, a couple of points to note. Period start date is counted as day 0. So that's not day 1. So the clock starts basically on day 2. So day 1 is going to be the period start date, which is going to be considered day 0. The payment penalty is going to be equal to essentially a 1/30th reduction of the HIPS code from that start date of the period to the date that the actual RAP is submitted and accepted. So that the receipt date is going to be that first covered date. So if we walk through an actual example here, you can see, let's say we have a patient that has an admission date of 1/1/2021. And we don't have all of our ducks in a row, and all of a sudden we're up at 1/10, and that's when we finally submit the RAP. Well, we know that it's late, right? Because the 5 day, you would have had to have that RAP out the door by 1/6, and since it is 1/10, we now have 9 days of penalties. So again, it's that 1/10 day that you submit it, you're actually going to be covered by that date. So it's going to be all the days leading up to that. So it's going to be 9-day penalty. You take that 9 divided by 30, so you have 9/30th, so your HIPS code value. In this example, we're going to say the HIPS code value is $2,000. We're reducing that by 9/30th, so a $600 reduction for an updated payment of $1,400. So you can see it's a significant penalty. You know, even if you had it back on, let's say, day 6, you're automatically going to have a 20% reduction at a minimum for any kind of RAP payment penalty you have. So it doesn't go by. A couple questions we get from here is what's counted as day 1. Again, day 1 is really going to be the second day of the period. Another common question we get is the penalty calculation. Are we saying if you're submitted on day 6, it's only a 1-day penalty because you're only 1 day late? No, it actually goes back to the start. So it's from that admission start date, the start date rather of the payment period to the actual date of submission is going to be how that calculation works. How you're going to identify it on the claim itself, you'll see the reduction amount displayed with a value code of QF on the claim, and then that'll indicate what that payment penalty amount is. A couple other pieces in terms of the matching to the final claim. From a HIPS code perspective, and this is again a common question that we get, and I think some common confusion from the beginning at least, is the HIPS code on the RAP must match rather the HIPS code on the final claim. So similar to today, same exact process. You have to have that HIPS code on the RAP match the final. However, the primary diagnosis code on the RAP does not have to match the primary diagnosis code on the final. So you can have a different primary diagnosis on 2, which is going to be important, which we'll talk about in some of the subsequent slides here. The other key piece here is that the RAP for any subsequent 30-day period can be billed at the same time as you bill that RAP for start of care or research. So again, let's say you have a patient that starts on 1/1. You can submit that RAP for that 1/1 period. You can also submit the RAP for the 1/31 period. Now, you may not get to that 1/31 period, but that's okay. And again, we're going to talk about that in some subsequent slides here. The important piece to note there is that you can bill 2 RAPs at the beginning of whatever that certification period is. So now we have the basics. So now we're going to get into the FAQs. And again, there's a lot of these questions that we've had internally and we've been asked multiple times. So we wanted to make sure, hopefully we cover a good portion of this here with the questions you might have during this FAQ section. So a couple of the pieces that we commonly hear here. Number one, do you need just one wrap for each admission? No. That'll be next year when we get into the notice of admission. That'll be when we only need just that one quote unquote wrap. That'll be a notice of admission then. But for the purposes of 2021, you're going to need a wrap for every single payment period you have. Next question, do the wrap rules apply to patients admitted prior to 2021 who cross over into the new year? So essentially those patients you're admitting today. Now, if you have a patient that you admitted today on 12/15, their second period is going to be on 1/14 of next year. Do I need a new, for that 1/14 start date, am I going to need a wrap for that patient? The answer is yes. So even the patients that are transitioning over from prior year, every single payment period in 2021 is going to need a wrap. So make sure you have that, and they also are going to apply to those new rules. So for that 1/14 wrap, you're going to need to get it in within 5 days. Next question there, is the new submission rule 5 calendar days or 5 business days? Another common question we've been getting, and the answer for this one is it's 5 calendar days, including the weekends and also including the holidays. We're not going by business days and by when CMS is open, it goes by 5 calendar days. So an important thing to note there is that starting on January 1st actually falls on a Friday. You're going to have, Saturday, Sunday, the weekends. That Monday, January 4th, is actually going to be day 3 for those 1/1/21 payment periods. So it's going to be, right off the bat, we're going to be, having to get those wraps out the door as soon as possible, since we will be on day 3 for those patients that are admitted, or those periods that start on 1/1. Next question here, does the OASIS need to be completed and locked in order to submit the wrap? We know that's the rule today. But however, no, under the new rules, and that's probably one of the biggest concerns when we first heard about this 5-day filing limit is, our QA process takes a long time. Sometimes, if a nurse is opening, we're also going to want to get a therapy eval completed as well. And that's not going to, 5 days isn't enough time for me. Well, that's why they really limited the amount of information that you need in order to build this wrap. One of those pieces is that you do not need the OASIS to be completed and locked in order to submit the wrap. So the big question that follows up with that is, all right, well, the OASIS is what I use for my HIPS code. What if I don't have that OASIS lock? I'm not going to have a HIPS code. The guidance that's been come out there is that you just need a valid HIPS code on that wrap. What our recommendation there is that you bill all wraps and final claims with that same generic HIPS code. This is going to play into part of our conversation with EMR readiness and having that conversation with your EMR and figure out what your options are there. But you really want to make sure that you're getting those wraps out the door as soon as possible. You obviously don't want to have to wait for that OASIS to be locked and completed. And in that situation, again, you're going to more than likely you're going to bill with a generic HIPS code. Whether it be 11AA1, which is going to be the lowest of those HIPS codes. You want to build the same HIPS really for all wraps and finals. Again, keeping in mind that the wrap does have to match the final claim in terms of what that HIPS code is. So you want to make sure you get the correct one out there, or the matching one out there. Next one there. So if I am billing with a generic HIPS, how is Medicare going to know how to pay the claim? What HIPS code should the claim pay at? Well, when we transitioned over to PDGM, the HIPS code really kind of went away in terms of its meaningful impact on how Medicare reimburses. Medicare's payment grouper is based off of a number of different elements. So if we think about PDGM, we have basically those 4 components for how you get reimbursed. So we have the clinical grouping and the comorbidity adjustment, which is going to be based on the diagnosis codes on the claim itself. You have your functional impairment score. That's going to be based on your answers to your OASIS questions, which that OASIS is then submitted to iKeys. And then you also have your referral source and your timing, which is going to be based on the information in the common working file. So all this information is how Medicare is pricing your HIPS code today, and that's not going to change in the future. So again, they're not using the HIPS code at all to pay anything. Today, they're using it only to pay that 20% of the wraps, but since wrap payments are going away in 2021, they wouldn't be using the HIPS code to pay anything. So the HIPS code itself is really irrelevant in terms of what you bill and how you get reimbursed. Now you're going to want your EMR to calculate the proper HIPS code behind the scenes in the EMR so that you are able to match up the paid HIPS code in Medicare system to what it should have paid in your EMR. But for billing purposes, you really don't need to worry about what that actual HIPS code going out on your wrap and your final claim is. Next question here, do I need a first billable visit to bill the second wrap? Again, another common question of confusion. So basically you have that 1/1 to 1/30 payment period to start. That next payment period starting on 1/31. Do I need to have a first billable visit to bill that 1/31 wrap or any subsequent wraps in any of those scenarios, even if you went, I would apply that same logic to wrap number 4, for instance? The answer is no. No, you do not need to bill a first billable visit. You don't need a first billable visit to be completed in order to bill that second wrap. How that's going to work from a logistics standpoint in terms of, you have that 0023 HIPS code line, which is on the claim. How that works today is that's going to be your first billable visit for your wrap. In the new model starting in 2021, that 0023 HIPS code line is always going to be equal to the period start date. So you would have, in that example I just listed, your 0023 HIPS code line would actually be 1/31. So the next question beyond that is, all right, well, I know for final claims, how is that going to work? Because my first billable visit on my final claim has to match that 0023 HIPS line. So for the 0023 HIPS line for second period final claims, it is still going to match that first billable visit. So you're going to have your first billable visit on that actual final claim be the same date as the 0023 HIPS line. So in most cases, we say some instances here, I would say, probably in most cases, your wrap HIPS line is probably not going to be the same date as your final claim HIPS line. And that is allowed in this new wrap billing. Another common question we get really has to center around the fact that we are billing 2 wraps from the start of care or from recertification. Do I need to cancel that second wrap if the patient is discharged prior to that subsequent 30-day period? And the answer is no, you do not. The wrap auto cancel rules are no longer applying. So there's not going to be any more wrap auto cancels. So those are going to be a thing of the past. There's no money to recover. That's really the reason why wrap auto cancels up here today, is to make sure that Medicare is recouping those funds in the situations where, let's say, you didn't submit a final claim because the patient was never admitted or ended up being deemed non-billable by the agency. Medicare needed a mechanism really to recover those funds internally. So the fact that there's no money taking place or changing hands in this situation, the wrap auto cancel rules are essentially, again, going out the window starting in 2021. So there's no need to cancel that second wrap. All right, so talk to me about LUPAs then. Do the no wrap LUPA rules still apply? And the answer to that is yes. But I'm going to throw a caveat out there. And Todd said he wanted to throw a big stop sign out there for some clip art for this one. You do not need to bill a wrap for LUPAs. However, that is definitely not the approach that we recommend. Even if you think it's going to be a LUPA, let's say it's a cath change, they've been a LUPA forever, you're only seeing them one visit every 30 days, you've been getting a LUPA payment historically, you want to take the chance and say, I don't need to bill a wrap in this situation, I'm just going to bill final. That, to me, opens the door up for way too much risk. So predicting LUPAs, as you see here, is often a difficult process. And even if you're anticipating it, if you had enough visits to cross it over into a full payment period, you're all of a sudden going to be out of money because you didn't submit that wrap timely. So even if you, again, are anticipating a LUPA, you should just bill the wrap just to be safe. And in all situations, all payment periods, you're gonna want to bill a wrap. If you did have a situation where the wrap is submitted late and the claim is a LUPA, how it's going to work from a payment penalty standpoint is that any visit performed prior to that submission date of your wrap would not be covered, and you would only get paid for the visits that were on or after that submission date for the wrap. So the payment penalty can't exceed what the actual wrap payment or LUPA payment would be, and that's essentially how the logistics for the payment penalty for LUPAs work. All right, so the next question, another common question. We talked about the holidays and Saturdays and Sundays and how they count in terms of the calculation for the days. Well, how are Saturday, Sunday submissions handled in determining timeliness? The electronic claims received on a weekend or a holiday are marked as received on the actual calendar date of receipt. Now, the caveat I'll throw out there on this one too is you have to submit it, and it actually has to be accepted as well. So remember, if you had a claim batch you generated, you submitted it to Medicare, and for whatever reason it rejected back, that would not count as a submission date. It has to be submitted and accepted. Now, submitted and accepted doesn't mean accepted and processed and paid by Medicare. It just means that the claim batch went through and Medicare acknowledged that it accepted the file. So that's going to be, that receipt date is going to count as the actual submission date when determining timeliness. Next question there. Is the new wrap rule the same as the notice of admission rule? Again, some confusion here. Me, for one, I'm not really sure why they have this whole new rule for just 1 year in place if they're going to change it starting in 2022, but it is two different things. So no, the NOA rule does not begin until January 1st, 2022. The one thing we mentioned before, a little bit of reprieve when we get into 2022, is that the NOA is a one-time submission that establishes the agency, the period of care, and covers all contiguous 30-day periods of care until discharge. So you're only going to need to do that once starting in 2022, similar to the notice of election process that we already have established in hospice today. It's only one time, and we're not going to need to do the continuous billing of it every 30 days like we're going to have to do next year with the new wrap rule. Next question there, another common one that we've gotten is, do I need a timely wrap if I'm billing MSP? So in those situations where we'll say different commercial insurance is a primary insurance and there's the balance left over that you're going to bill Medicare as a secondary payer, do I need a timely wrap in those scenarios? The answer is yes. So you're going to need to have a wrap timely in those situations. This definitely becomes tricky from an EMR standpoint. And some common feedback that we've gotten is, I'm not sure from a logistics standpoint if our EMR even allows for that. So if your EMR does not allow for billing of wraps when you have Medicare listed as a secondary payer, our recommendation there would be to key those wraps directly into DDE, make sure they get in, again, within those 5 days, so that if you do have a situation where you need to bill down the road, that you have that timely wrap submitted. All right, next question here. What if I don't have an acceptable primary diagnosis code at intake? So chances are, you're getting the information coming over from the referral source. With that initial order from the physician is coming a reason. This patient needs home care because of this. Hopefully you're going to have a valid diagnosis code for this. But in those rare situations where, let's say you don't have a primary diagnosis code that's valid, how should you handle that? Guidance we're given on this one is to make sure you're using any kind of valid diagnosis code. Again, the diagnosis code, to reiterate, the wrap does not necessarily match what the final claim diagnosis code is. You're obviously going to want to have a valid primary diagnosis code and an accurate diagnosis code for that final claim billing. That's going to determine your clinical grouping. Again, from an accuracy and compliance reasons, you're going to want to make sure that is exactly what the primary diagnosis code is. But for the wrap, it doesn't necessarily need to be the actual reason the patient's being seen. Now, we would recommend, again, the fact that we would want it to be as accurate as possible for that wrap. And hopefully, in most cases, that wrap primary diagnosis code is going to end up being what the final one is, but it's not necessarily going to be the case. So in the cases where, let's say you you get a muscle weakness generalized coming over from that referral source, but you're going to have your clinician go out and see the patient anyway, we're recommending using the same generic valid primary diagnosis codes in those instances. We were talking to an agency earlier this week that's using hypertension as an example as the same valid primary diagnosis code that they're going to use in all instances when this situation occurs. But hopefully, again, you're going to have those situations be few and far between. This is probably another area where I know a lot of agencies have started to migrate towards pre-billing. Maybe pre-billing is, or sorry, pre-coding. Pre-coding may be something that becomes more popular for this, but again, I wouldn't, the amount of duplication that typically takes place from a coding standpoint after the clinician actually goes out and completes that initial visit really makes me more recommend just going with this approach of just using the same generic diagnosis code. Again, making sure it's a valid diagnosis code in these situations. Next question there. How long will the RAP take to process and pay? This is a great question, and one that I'm looking forward to seeing what the actual results are. So this, according to CMS, and this is in an email I received, so there's nothing really I've seen published to speak to this. The RAPs should be processed, essentially saying immediately or in an online session in DDE or the following day for batch submission. Now, I don't know if this means processed and quote unquote paid, or just processing throughout the system. So we know in today's world with the RAPs, it typically takes between 5 and 7 days for those RAPs to process. Now we have a much more limited data set, and we know we have much stricter timeframes now that we're trying to operate with. So I would think that that 5 to 7 days would be much, much less. At least that's my hope. So that'll be something definitely keep an eye on, especially in the early parts of 2021, is how quickly they are processing. In an ideal world, it is going to be an almost immediate, or hopefully a 1 to 2 day turnaround time compared to the 5 to 7. But again, this will be a time will tell. I am only kind of regurgitating the information I got from CMS, which is a little vague in terms of what the actual answer is there. All right, I think I have a couple more here before I turn it over to Todd. Next question on here. Can I submit a subsequent RAP today for subsequent periods starting in January? So essentially, again, I mentioned before, my admissions that happened in December. We know in the new world, starting in 2021, that I can submit 2 RAPs at the same time. Can I do that today? Is the question there. The answer is no. In fact, Max will only be able to accept new RAPs starting on January 4th. So even if you have a RAP that you're ready to roll on January 1st, they're not going to be able to accept them until January 4th. We actually ran into the same situation earlier this year with PDGM starting, where the new PDGM RAPs weren't able to be accepted until January 4th as well. So same situation there. The next question there is, how do I file an exception? So in those situations where you submitted a RAP and it was late, but you think you should be entitled to the reimbursement because the lateness was out of your control, what do I do in those situations? So this kind of walks you through exactly what you're supposed to do. So in order to request an extension, you want to do the following. You want to enter the information supporting that circumstance that applies to the RAP in the remarks field. So that's really on page 4 of the actual claim if you're in DDE. Example there, this says if the RAP was, this actually came straight from CGS's website, one of the Macs. If the RAP to a claim was originally received timely, but the RAP was canceled and resubmitted to correct an error, enter in the remarks field timely RAP, cancel and rebill. Add modifier KX to the HIPS code reported on the 0023 line, and agency should resubmit the corrected RAPs promptly, generally within 2 business days of canceling the original RAP. So that's an important piece there to keep in mind is making sure that in those situations where you do have to cancel, to make sure you get that resubmission completed quickly. I've listened to one of the a couple other webinars and just having some general discussion. I think some of the common reasons where we're seeing RAPs reject or go to RTP have to do with diagnosis coding. So one option that actually is out there is that you can include all your diagnosis codes on the RAP. We're not recommending you do that. So we're recommending in that situation, you're just billing that primary diagnosis code. And as soon as you ensure that it's a valid one, that's it. That's all you need to include. The more diagnosis codes that you're including on that RAP, it's just going to open you up to risk in terms of entering a diagnosis code that may not be valid, whether you missed a digit. In that situation, you're just exposing yourself to potential risk of the RAP RTPing or rejecting. So make sure that you're restricting, again, the number of diagnosis codes. It would be our recommendation to just the primary. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Todd Montigney.
All right, Nick, thank you very much. And I I appreciate you after 19 years of finally sharing the spotlight on these webinars and allow me to present with you, even though it's only 4 slides compared to your 2024. So many of you who might not know Nick, you know, we started our Blacktree webinar series back in May or June, and Nick was really the creator of doing this for Blacktree, and as you probably know, is a frequent contributor to a lot of these. And this is my first one doing it with Blacktree here. So it took a lot of fighting to allow him to share the spotlight, but you know, such an important topic like RAPs and changes in 2021, he decided to bring along another expert. So thank you, Nick, for that. And great interaction as you were talking. You know, I was looking through the chats and seeing a lot of the Q&As, and it seems like you know, we must have been on point with a lot of the questions, because it seems like a lot of the questions coming in were probably addressed with the frequently asked questions that you went through there. But as we talk through the end of this presentation, we'll open it up and answer some additional ones that maybe not been addressed during the presentation. And some of those questions that might come in are ones we might not still know the answers to, because CMS hasn't provided complete guidance in every scenario out there, but we'll do our best to answer them for you. So I get Blacktree recommendations here, and really when you look at Blacktree recommendations under this new RAP rule, it really comes down to a couple of things. I mean, we're dealing with the payment penalty, as we know about, if you don't submit within the 5 days. So the ultimate goal is, how do I get my RAP at the door as quick as possible, so I have enough, my back's not against the wall, and risk the possibility of errors submitted with my RAP that now allows the RAP to process after that window. So our goal with these recommendations is, how do you get them out the door quicker? How do you really understand what's going on within your EMR? You can be doing everything right, you understand all the rules, but if your EMR is not functioning the way you expect it to in accordance to the rules, or you don't understand how the EMR is functioning, you know, obviously that can create some problems. And finally, when you look at it, is how do you track all this? You know, sometimes I think you know, if you even just do billing in general, you know, if you're billing to a Medicare Advantage payer, maybe you submit a batch of claims and they don't get on file, right? Or they get on file at a later period. So there has to be a tracking mechanism you have in place to really make sure the work that you did was actually received and is processing. So that's the stuff I'm going to talk about over these next couple slides in regards to Blacktree recommendations and also EMR usage. So that first bullet point really comes down to locking that first visit. Nick talked about the requirements of billing as needing the verbal order for services, and also completing that first visit for your start of care. So we all know we have clinicians out there that, you know, might not be syncing frequently their laptops or tablets, might not be locking their visits or letting it drag on for a couple days. You might see that more with contractors you might see it more with people who are part-time, but you know, and you probably have policies in place to say lock these within 24 hours, but we all know there's some clinicians who don't do that, right? So you're really gonna have to drive down that accountability of making sure, especially that start of care visit, the main driver of getting that RAP out the door is locked within your EMR system. I imagine most of the EMR functionality is not going to allow that claim to go out the door, the claim being the RAP, to go out the door if that first visit's not locked. So that's crucial. It's going to be crucial to monitor those reports. It'll be crucial to educate your field staff on the importance of locking that first visit and making sure you can lock it without the OASIS being fully completed. You can still go through that process of, you know, waiting for the PT to go out there and do their functional assessment of the patient if you order PT and wait to complete that OASIS, but you still need to lock the fact that that first visit was completed, likely to generate your RAP within the EMR. Nick talked about the primary diagnosis and what to do in those situations. Is, you know, to circle back on it, is you want to get that diagnosis on the claim as soon as possible, because again, that's going to be one of the requirements for your RAP submission. So our recommendation is that's occurring within intake. Not to say that might change later on when your certified coder might go through and review that after the OASIS, but at intake, that primary diagnosis needs to be put on the claim to allow that RAP to drop for billing. Also looking at like how frequently are you actually billing your RAPs? I mean, in the current model, some agencies say, you know, I'm billing RAPs every day. You know, that It takes time. Maybe it takes an hour every day for your biller to go through and submit a wrap batch to the payer, depending on what steps you need to do with your intermediate or within your EMR. But obviously, you don't want to do that in this new model. We recommend that you're going through and you're billing wraps out daily, because obviously, if you delay a day, that could be the day that will put you over to penalty period, especially if you're not submitting on weekends. You don't have a weekend bill, or most agencies we work with, but might be something you want to consider if someone wants to do some part-time hours on the weekend, to continue submitting billing batches out for wraps as frequently as possible, so you minimize the amount of days it takes for that wrap to get on file. If you don't have a weekend person, or someone who's willing to do that part-time, we really consider doing 2 batches on Mondays and Fridays. And the thought being that, on Friday, you want to get as many eligible wraps out the door as possible. So you start your day off, you do your billing batch, and really at the end of the day, you go through and send another one out, just because you're likely not billing wraps over the weekend. And when you come in on Monday morning, you might have your weekend admissions that came in. You have the ones that maybe started on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, and actually had their first visits completed and the diagnosis put in, is eligible for wrap billing. You want to get them out the door as soon as possible. But you might have additional ones that trickle in throughout the course of the weekend, depending on how your weekend processes work and how you admit patients. There might be slight delays in terms of locking visits or getting that primary diagnosis code on the claim. So we say, you might want to even consider getting a second batch out for all those ones that might trickle in throughout the course of the day, Monday. That way, again, if you have an admission on Saturday morning, you're not waiting till Tuesday to build a wrap. You're doing it Monday. You're allowing yourself a few extra grace days to make sure that it was received by the payer and put on file. So that's our recommendation: as many batch billing batches as possible for wraps, the better, to minimize the amount of errors that might occur from being late. Next, you look at your RTPs. Your RTPs, if you don't know, are your return to providers. Like, you build a wrap to Medicare and something was wrong with it that kicked it back out for correction. They return it. Now, your billers should be monitoring this daily for both your wraps and your final claims, but our recommendation is if they're not doing that, they should be, right? Just to fix those errors. And our recommendation there is, right now, CMS is not saying that if the wrap was received within the 5 days and it kicks out to RTP and you correct it, that's right now is not one of the stated reasons for an exception if you correct that wrap after the 5-day period. So, long story short, they're saying it's likely a penalty. But we also know that this is a very similar process to hospices and the NOE process within hospices. And what they ended up doing with NOEs is that as long as you submitted your claim timely and it was received, if it kicked back out to RTP and you corrected it within 2 days, they allowed a lot of those exceptions to go through. So our recommendation is, if you have any wraps that go into RTP in 2021, that you're doing a screenshot of that wrap. If it kicks back to RTP and you're correcting it after that 5-day window. That way it's showing proof that it was received timely. You may have made a correction later, the correction to it after that time period, but you have some sort of proof that you can send with the exception if needed, showing that it was in fact untimely. So again, Medicare is not saying right now that's an acceptable reason, but if you document that, it may be similar to what the NOE process is currently. So document that if it's timely and you need to correct it later on. Next, determining alerts in the EMR to notify what wraps are at risk of timely fines. This really comes back to understanding your EMR. Some EMRs have a lot of features to deal with the wrap process. Other ones might be a little weaker in these areas. But you want to know, like, hey, if it's day 4, how many of my claims or wraps are going to be late tomorrow? Which ones do I need to focus on? I need to put a high priority on and either reach out to a clinician who didn't lock their visit yet, or no diagnosis code is put in the system yet. You want to be able to flag those accounts and know that they're coming within the timely filing periods. And if there's no EMR report to track that, you might need to go back to basic manual entry, creating your own log, creating your own sheet of here's all my admissions that occurred, here's all my ones that are up for recert. When are they due? Have they gone out? Yes or no? Some sort of tracking system if your EMR does not have that functionality. So again, some are better than others. It really comes down to what I said earlier, understanding your EMR, what it does, and how some of these features work within the system. Nick mentioned about key and wraps within the system for Medicare secondary payers. Our advice is if you get to day 5 and your wrap is just finally getting out the door, your best bet is probably to hand key that directly into DDE. The reason why is because you hand key it, you'll be able to see the results if it was received instantly. Nick mentioned about the processing will pay immediately or not. That's still up in the air with what their terminology is there, but it will be received and you'll be able to see if it's in a good processing status immediately. If you try submitting those claims electronically, there's challenges with timing. I say timing because you might be submitting it to a clearinghouse and maybe you don't know how long, even though you submitted to the clearinghouse, that doesn't mean it's on file with your MAC yet. So you need to understand then is how often is your clearinghouse submitting the claims or what time they're submitting those claims to your MAC. If you don't know that, then again, DDE is the best way of submitting those claims just to ensure they're on file and it gets rid of that unknown. What I read online is that the MAC considers the date received before 5 p.m. Your local time is their date. So if you submit it after that time, it's considered the next day. So again, manual DDE entry will be the best way to eliminate when you're back against the wall last second of getting that wrap on file. We also recommend that when you're billing your wraps, you're submitting at your start of care, both your first and second period at the same time. Nick mentioned in the frequently asked questions about, no need to cancel your second period if they don't go on. You don't need to have your first billable visit performed or know the date of your first billable visit for your second period. So bill both at the same time, get them on file because that eliminates the need to have to track that second period and possibly being late for that second certification period. CMS is allowing that to occur. Bill the same generic HIPs for all wraps and final claims. So Nick mentioned, you don't need to have your OASIS completed to bill your wrap. So the majority of times you're not going to know, what your HIPS code is before day 5, before that OASIS is locked. Maybe your internal QA and coding team reviews it. You want to get that out the door, and your HIPS code has to match both on your wrap and your final claims. So some EMRs are giving you options out there to say, what method do I want for the HIPS code to generate on my wrap? Do I want it based on the OASIS? Do I want to use a generic one? Our advice, if the OASIS use a generic, and if the OASIS is completed, use that one. Our advice is your best to use a generic because Medicare is going to process your claims based on all the information that's in the common working file, on the OASIS, and also your diagnosis coding, the same what Nick talked about in the frequently asked questions. So if you use that same generic HIPS code, it's consistent. It'll always be the same on both. And as a result, you won't run into any issues along the way of wraps and final claims not matching HIPS codes. Determine tracking tools in your EMRs for wraps submitted but not paid. So you might even want to expand that of not just your EMR, but also maybe your clearinghouse. I know some clearinghouses out there have functionalities where they kind of track your claims in Medicare, where they are, what status. You want to match that up, obviously, to your tracking tool once you submitted and making sure they're paid. So again, if you're monitoring your RTP daily, you're monitoring your wraps that have been submitted and wraps that are on hold right now, you're waiting for information to submit. It all comes down to the tracking of it overall. There'll probably be some way to leverage your clearinghouse and also checking them within the DDE system. A common question that would come up next is determine if your Medicare Advantage plans are adopting the 5-day timely filing rule. So if you take a second here, Paul, if you want to load, we actually have a poll question on this because there it is. So the poll question, have any of your Medicare Advantage plans informed your agency that they intend to adopt the 5-day wrap filing rule. I'll say, I've talked to a lot of clients. This is probably their biggest question right now. What are the Medicare Advantages doing? And we ran into the same issue with PDGM in the beginning. Not many of them came out ahead of time to say, are we paying PDGM if I'm paying PPS? I haven't heard of one Medicare Advantage plan yet say that they're moving on to this with this wrap rule. And if they do, there's challenges with it, and there'll be operational challenges that come with it too, because if you need to get it out the door within 5 days and you're not completing your OASIS, well, your HIPS code on your claim for Medicare Advantage is what drives your reimbursement. They don't have the pricers in place like Medicare does to look at your common working file, to look at your OASIS that you submitted, and also look at your diagnosis code groupings out there and adjust for them. They don't have those tools available, so they really just go based off the HIPS code that you submitted. So that will be, if you have anyone, and I'll get a poll question later what the results were.
We have 13%
how to handle these situations.
13% yes. So
oh yeah,
yeah.
Very nice. Interesting. I'd love to hear about that, because that'll be obviously an operational challenge. And if you really look at if they are going to do that, you're going to want to prioritize those patients within your OASIS and coding team to get those OASISs locked very timely within the before the 5-day window, which may impact how you handle your therapy evals and that impact on the OASIS. So if you need that OASIS completed to drop that HIPS code so it be accurate for your Medicare Advantage payer, then there'll have to be some additional operational challenges of prioritizing workflow within your OASIS and coding team.
The challenge there, to Todd's point, is making sure you have that actual HIPS code, because Medicare, we know their grouper prices based on the information, on the diagnosis codes on the claim, the common working file information, and the information on the OASIS. Medicare Advantage plans aren't necessarily doing that. Most Medicare Advantage plans are just going to be paying based on that HIPS code. So that's why we're saying it's important to make sure you have the actual HIPS code on those claims. Thanks,
Nick. And next bullet point I'll skip over, just really know your cash flow impact. Nick has a few slides that he'll go through at the end here of some examples we did here, but know what the impact is. You can use some of those percentages coming up. Next, move on to your EMR impact. These are just some general questions of what you should be asking your EMR vendor, and every EMR vendor is handling this a little bit different. So I know, talking with some of my clients that use a variety of EMRs, there's been release notes that came out, there's been webinars that they may have done to show the functionality. Hopefully you've been a part of one of them. If not, find that information ASAP and reach out to your vendor to find out how they're handling a lot of these changes. But we wanted to provide some questions here just to ask them, is understanding their workflow. Like what steps need to be completed within the EMR to allow the wrap to be generated? Do you need, if the diagnosis that might be put at intake, is that a different spot in your EMR that might come from your coders doing it? How does that all flow? And if those diagnosis codes are different, will the wrap drop? So really just understanding, long story short, understanding that process is critical. Can you generate the second wrap at the start of care at the same time as the first one? That's practice. You get it on file. Does there a functionality to do that, and what does that functionality look like? Are they allowing for the generic HIPS to be used? And what will my options be for generating the HIPS code for the wrap and final claims? And again, I know some EMRs are allowing 3 different options: either generic HIPS, the actual real HIPS, or generic unless the real HIPS is available. Really understand that, understand what those options are. Again, our recommendations are using the generic HIPS. Medicare Advantage, can the rules be set up differently for a Medicare Advantage payer? So you have your setup for Medicare to get it out the door. We mentioned about the challenges of Medicare Advantage of probably needing the OASIS completed to get that real HIPS to get the accurate reimbursement. Is there different rules that need to be done then or set up within the system to allow for that? And how do you turn those rules on? We mentioned about the tracking tools. Here are claims or wraps that haven't gone out the door yet. Here are ones that have been submitted and we haven't had a payment posting for yet, or a posting within the system. And also, how do you track the ones that may have been RTP? And that's really going to be more in the DDE system. And finally, before I turn it over to Nick again, additional questions you ask your EMR alerts. What alerts are built in to notify the reps are at risk of timely filing? So again, this comes back down to the tracking. Will there be alerts? Will be a special report out there to give you this information? Is a one-stop shop that shows all my reps and where they stand? Really understanding that information within your EMR. Your primary diagnosis codes. How does your EMR handle non-acceptable diagnosis codes? Nick mentioned about maybe that's happening at intake, within this new model. But like, what if it's a questionable encounter diagnosis code, one that's not accepted or not enough detail yet? Is your EMR flagging that so that rep's not going out the door with that unacceptable diagnosis code that might risk the fact that an RTP claim occurs? How's your system handling cash posting for it? We mentioned that there's $0 now for your these wraps in 2021. Your remittance advice is going to have a blend of these accounts that are paid wraps from 2020 at the 20% rate and ones that are at the 2021. How are they going to post that zero pay for the wrap within your system? A lot of times you need a transaction line in some EMRs to post against. So it's going to need to create that information. Just a question to ask of how that gets posted and applied. And then I'm sure it goes to a tracking next of did a claim process right. MSP billing, we talked about, how do I generate that within the system, a wrap? Some systems don't allow that. And more importantly, everything that the EMR vendor tells you what to do, how am I testing that? I know some releases are happening later this month. You're not going to have many days to process or test the system. How do I test that this functionality that's there in fact works? That'll be important. Maybe you're already doing some of that testing. But if you're not, try to, because obviously it's a critical piece, especially when you can't even submit the wraps until January 4th. In the new year, you want to make sure you get it right the first time, especially within those first couple days. So Nick, I'll turn it back to you now. You can go over cash flow impact.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate it. And some great dialogue in the chat. One actually great point regarding the Medicare Advantage that I didn't even think of. We're seeing a lot of comments that they aren't necessarily adopting the penalty, but they are adopting the zero pay. So that's something when you're contacting your Medicare Advantage plans, when you're asking the question, how are you planning on, how are you handling the new wraps? Those would be the two questions I would ask. Is there a zero pay for the wrap? You obviously want to make sure your AR is accurate in the system. And then the second part to that will be, is there a penalty? But that's a good point. Didn't even think of that. Cash flow impact. So, one of the big pieces, obviously leading up to this year with PDGM, was going to be the cash flow impact in those early months of the year. We know switching from that 60-day episodic payment to the 30-day payment period, on top of switching from the 60% of wrap payments, 50 or 60% of that wrap code value or HIPS code value down to 20%, had a significant hit on cash flow. So we wanted to do use the same concept and apply that to the no pay wraps. Now, knowing it's not going to be as significant, we went through and did a couple of different scenarios, and it actually is pretty significant when we looked at the numbers. So this is more of a definitely an illustration that you can take back to your agency and make sure that there's no surprises come January, February, which are really the 2 months that we see significantly impacted by this, and looking at what that cash flow impact is going to be for 2021. So I want to walk through this because we have a lot of questions I want to get to, some of them here. In this assumption here, we're going to use one wrap, one final claim per day. No case mix, wage index, or volume changes for 2020. We're going to use the standard rates for Medicare for last year and this year. Days to wrap, we're going to say 7 days in 2020. That's going to change to 3 days starting next year. Days to final claim, we're going to say is going to be 10 days. Days to pay the wrap is going to be 7 days, and days to pay the final is 14 days. So this slide here really gives you a breakdown of exactly what that looks like. And some people might need some reading glasses. I'm going to use my printout because I can't read that too well. This basically is showing you what the impact of changing from the 20% to the zero pay. And you can see as we go across, this is really looking at the last month, comparing December of 2020, what we're estimating the cash flow to be, out 6 months into June. Really you start to see the cash start to normalize in March. But in this example, we're going to take a $12 million agency. And you can see here, this top line shows the 2020 PDGM wrap cash, which essentially dries up in the middle of January. The PDGM, 2020 PDGM final claim dollars, which essentially is going to get paid through February using those assumptions we had. We know that wrap cash is gone for the 2021 PDGM claims, and the PDGM final claims, we're really not going to start to see many payments coming in for them until the end of February. So what does that mean in terms of cash flow impact? Well, using the assumptions that we use, you can see it's about 11% reduction in cash in January compared to December, and that number increases significantly up to almost 27% in February. And I mentioned it starts to normalize in March. We get back to normal numbers. You can see 4.5% up, 1%, 4.5%. That's all going to be based on the number of days in the month. With the increase in the standard rate, that's what's generating that positive number there. But important to make sure that you're aware of what that cash flow impact is going to be for your agency. And again, if you have some questions on this, or we actually developed this tool. If you want to see the tool itself, feel free to reach out to Todd or myself, or contact us through our website so that you can plug in these numbers. We actually have a tool that includes a CBSA code, so you can plug in the CBSA if you have a change in your value there to see what the impact's going to be for your agency. So again, something we definitely recommend doing going forward. Here's the resources that we have in terms of everything that we presented here. And now we're going to get to Q&A here with present day Nick Seabrook, I guess, with a little bit more hair, and 2011 Todd Montigney. Before we do that, what is your biggest concern with the new wrap rule? So you can see there the 4 choices: agency readiness. Is it your internal operations? Is it your EMR's readiness? Is it CMS being ready? Or would you say it's cash flow? So that would be our last poll question here before we tackle some of those Q&As. Todd, I don't know if you've looked at any of them, but there's some great questions in there. I have a couple earmarked here that I wanted to address. First, there was a question regarding the submission and acknowledgement file. So regarding the 999 and the 277 file, think of it this way. You're going to want to have that 277 file, and I'll kind of walk you through it. The 999 file is basically the batch that basically says I made it to Medicare's front door. So this is saying it got accepted or rejected. The 277 file lets you know that the claim is let into process. So in that situation, what we were talking about before, you want to make sure you're getting that 277 file to let you know that it actually made it and acknowledged. And the question was, are the wrap batches going to have that acknowledgement? And the answer to that is yes. One of the other questions, there was a couple common questions regarding the MSP scenario or situations where Medicare's system wasn't updated. The MSP scenario, if you didn't know that Medicare was a secondary payer, this kind of goes back to twofold. Number one, you're going to want to make sure that you're checking eligibility, especially at the change of the new year, with when those open enrollments typically are. You're going to want to make sure you're checking those pretty frequently to see that you do have, you're identifying those situations where Medicare is a secondary payer. If, let's say, Medicare updates their system to say that they're a secondary payer, and their update doesn't take place until halfway through the year, that's a situation where you could potentially file an exception and get the override of the timely filing rules. But it's important to make sure that you're documenting when you're actually doing those acknowledgement checks or eligibility checks to see if Medicare is showing up as a secondary or a primary payer. So that's all going to go back to timing, and also making sure that you're diligent within your operation in checking what that eligibility is. It's going to be even more crucial now that we're in this 5-day timely filing piece. A common question we've also gotten is more on the recert wraps. So our interpretation of the rule is in terms of when you can bill wrap 3, for instance. Our interpretation of the rule is that you can bill wraps for that period and the subsequent period at the same time, and it can't be until day 1 of that period, period 1 or period 3. So in the recert situation, you could bill wrap 3 on day 1 of when wrap 3 begins, but you can also bill wrap 4 on that same day. That's our interpretation of what that rule specifically is. Todd, you identify one other question I wanted to address. There was some confusion, I think, that I created with that 1-4 comment in terms of when Medicare is accepting accepting those wraps. I think that's probably more when they're actually going to show up in Medicare system is that 1/4 date. So everything is going to be effective 1/1. I didn't mean to confuse in terms of, it's not, that doesn't mean it's going to start on 1/4. The new rule starts on 1/1, so that is going to be the effective date. If you bill on 1/2, you're going to have that acknowledgement that you billed it on 1/2, and it's going to show up in your system that you billed it on 1/2. It's not going to show up in Medicare system until 1/4. So you're not going to be able to check, for instance, on 1/2 if you submitted it that actually got accepted.
Yeah, just one I want to address. I didn't get a chance to read through all of them because some of them were in the chat and some were in the QA. But one person mentioned about, I'll read it. It says, when you submit a wrap with a generic HIPS, it will not match our final claim. Do we have to cancel the wrap and rebill with the matching HIPS code? The thought process there, if you're billing with a generic wrap or generic HIPS code for the wrap, you should be using the generic HIPS code on your final claim too. And that's going to come down to how's your EMR set up. But in that case, you wouldn't cancel your wrap. You shouldn't have to ever cancel your wrap for that HIPS code, because you should be using that same generic HIPS code for both.
Great. I also saw a couple of questions regarding, is there any red flags that are going to come up by billing the same generic HIPS code? If Medicare is given this guidance to bill a generic HIPS code, I would say the answer to that is no. Again, they're really not using the HIPS code to do anything anymore. They're basing all the payments off of the other elements in their grouper. With the diagnosis code, that's something I would not be concerned about either. Again, you're just billing the same generic diagnosis code or diagnosis code and some exceptions on that wrap. Your final diagnosis code is what they're going to be looking at. To me, the wrap in 2021 is just going to be more about, here, we're seeing this patient and making sure that it's marked as a patient that's being seen by the agency. Medicare, since they're not really paying off the wrap, they're not going to be doing anything from a claim edit standpoint. The final claims themselves are really what Medicare is going to be looking at instead. And again, I wouldn't be concerned about the generic HIPS code because it's not what they're basing the payment on anyway. So with that, I know there's a lot of other questions. What I think we'll do is, if you have some of the additional follow-up questions that you want answered, we'll try our best to reach out to you and answer those questions. If you don't hear from us, please definitely reach out to Todd or myself. Really appreciated everybody's time today. There was a lot of great information, good dialogue that came through the chat. The poll results are definitely pretty interesting. In terms of that last one, what's the biggest concern? Agency readiness was actually the winner, 41%, followed up by EMR readiness, 29%, cash flow at 19%, and CMS readiness at 11%. So some great dialogue. I appreciate everyone's contributions again, and I can now use the dad joke and say that that's a wrap for this presentation. So thanks, Todd, for joining me today. All right.
Thanks for allowing me, Nick. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.